Hello YouTube. Over the course of the past 10 years of making Elder Scrolls lore videos, I talked about many interesting subjects, and one of the most fun categories of subjects for me personally is the category of interesting information that you have to dig deep for that isn't outright explained but still quite interesting to know about, even though it's non-essential. And today I grouped some of the most interesting and obscure pieces of lore from the third era, the era of the early Elder Scrolls games, into one big long-form lore video for you to enjoy. And I of course included timestamps so that you can skip a certain topic that you're already familiar with or have no interest in, like this intro. Now, that having been said, this isn't a video going deep into the villains or big mysteries or a definitive list of all interesting things. Rather, I'll tell you stories of mostly non-obvious things that you can find in the third era's lore that I've covered over the many years of making these videos and that you might find interesting to know about as background information to you playing the games. Alright, that having been said, let's start with one of my favorite subjects that I covered over the years, the children of Emperor Uriel Septim VII, specifically his non-Martin Septim children, after the intro.
So, Uriel Septim VII. Emperor Uriel has had quite a long and rich backstory, which I detailed a few months ago in my video on him. So if you want his full story, be sure to watch that video, which is in the description. But for this subject, we need to take a bit of a closer look at his personal life, specifically in the early years of his rule. You see, overall in the early years of his reign, it's said that he was an optimistic, fair and talented ruler. And it is said that he was very well liked by most of the citizens of the Empire, who adored him as their emperor. It is also during this time that he married the woman who we would have as legitimate children with, a woman named Call Avoria, a reportedly beautiful woman who was very popular with the Empire's citizens. This would be Emperor Uriel's only official wife, as despite a lot of marital problems, he does not seem to have divorced or disowned her. You see, behind closed doors, Calavoria was a manipulative, arrogant and ambitious woman, who seems to have vied with her husband for power over the Empire, as she'd more or less seduced him into a marriage that he would quickly come to regret after marrying. This led to a marriage with a lot of fighting behind closed doors, where Uriel Septim and Empress Kala would often try to hurt one another, something which likely made for quite an unhappy childhood for his legitimate children who were part of the household. As with Kala, he had 4 legitimate children. The eldest was a daughter named Princess Ariella, the crown princess. Then came Prince Geldol, then Prince Enman, and finally the youngest child, Prince Ebel. Now, likely because of the unhappy marriage, Emperor Uriel also fathered 2 illegitimate children that we know of, as he reportedly slept with several of his aides. One was called Calaxus, and the other was called Martin. Now, on Martin I've spoken at length in the past, so I'll put a video dedicated to his full extensive backstory in the description, but the other 5 children I have yet to talk about, so let's start with the oldest child, Princess Ariel. Now, Princess Uriel was the crown princess of the Septim dynasty during the years before the Imperial simulacrum, which was the period of time where her father, Emperor Uriel, was locked away in oblivion by the treacherous battle mage Jaegar Tharn. In the first Elder Scrolls game, the Elder Scrolls Arena, we worked to end this whole problem. Now, very little is known about Princess Ariel, other than that we know that her very existence was a bit of a threat to Jaegar Tharn, who knew that if he wanted to enact a coup in the Empire, he could not just kill the Emperor, as if he did that, she would succeed him in order to light the dragon fires, and so instead of assassinating the Emperor, he locked the Emperor up and impersonated him instead, so that there would not have to be another coronation and another ceremony for lighting the dragon fires with Ariel. Now, other than that, we know that Jaegar Tharn, while impersonating the Emperor, wanted to take Princess Ariel, who was just 16 at the time, as his wife, likely not in the persona of the Emperor, but rather when he was able to take his disguise off, so take his wife as Jaegar Tharn instead of as the Emperor. Now, the intention with that was obviously to become a part of the Septim family officially, and make sure that if he one day decided to let the Emperor die, he could still have some legitimate way of exercising power over the Empire. We don't really know what happened to her after the Imperial simulacrum, as the marriage seems to have never happened. Perhaps Jaegar Tharn had her killed in the end if she didn't cooperate, or she died of some other reason, as we know that about 40 years later, during the time of the Oblivion Crisis, when she should have been around 50 to 60 years old, she was no longer around, as Uriel's eldest son, Geldol, had been named Crown Prince. Perhaps she was still around, but disowned for some reason or another, but then she would likely have been assassinated by the Mythic Dawn as well, around the Oblivion Crisis time. Although I think it's most likely that she died of some other calamity somewhere before the Oblivion Crisis, otherwise we would have known about her. Now, to talk about the new Crown Prince, Cyrodiil, he, alongside Uriel, has the most extensive backstory, as we know that during the latter years of his father's reign, he had already taken on many of the ruling responsibilities of his aging father, and he had already had a great responsibility within the government. The tragic thing about him is that we know that he and his younger brothers had not taken any wives and hadn't married for a very long time, as they had feared that marrying someone from another province would show favoritism and lead to discontent in other provinces who didn't get an imperial princess. And then finally, when he was able to get married to a princess from High Rock, a girl named Tamriel, it turned out that she was a secret Mythic Dawn agent who lived the lie of their marriage until that fateful day when the Oblivion Crisis started, and she killed him when the Emperor and all his heirs were assassinated. The man was killed by his own wife. Damn. Now, the other two legitimate sons we know literally nothing about, other than that Enman was just 1 year younger than Cyrodiil, and Abel was 2 years younger than Enman, with Cyrodiil being assassinated at the age of 56, Cyrodiil at the age of 55, and Abel at the age of 53. Now, the fact that these three were not allowed to marry means that they likely had no children, unless they had bastard sons as well, which, I mean, is likely, meaning that the Septim line might still be out there in some shape or form in these bastards of these three princes, which is pretty interesting, although now that the Dragonfires are no longer required to keep Tamriel safe from Oblivion after Martin's sacrifice, I doubt that they would have much chance of getting the throne. In fact, I would not be surprised if Titus Mede I, or perhaps some of the other short-lived rulers before him in the opening years of the 4th era after the fall of the Septim dynasty, would have them assassinated, or perhaps the Mythic Dawn already did that, as they might have already found those bastards if the princes didn't do a good job at hiding them. But talking about bastard children, Uriel Septim VII had one more son that we know of, the bastard son Calaxes. Now, we know that Martin was hidden away and never spoken of, and basically unknown to anyone but Grandmaster Joffrey, but Calaxes was actually acknowledged. You see, Calaxes was officially adopted by Emperor Uriel into his household and was named Prince, not in line for the throne, but a very public figure. Calaxes even got a very prestigious and public position out of it, as he became Archbishop of the One in the Temple of the One, which was then center of the 9 Divines worship on Tamriel. Now, I think a good reason for this position might have been in order to make sure that Calaxes was accepted by the public, but was perhaps put in a position where he was not able to have children as an archbishop. I don't know if archbishops can have children in the Elder Scrolls universe, but that would make a lot of sense in my opinion. Now, unfortunately for him, he would meet a quite violent end long before his father and his brothers would be assassinated by the Mythic Dawn, as Calaxes got into a severe argument with Emperor Uriel, his father, as Uriel wanted to reduce the powers of the 9 Divines clergy, and according to some sources, Calaxes was so unhappy with that he planned to rebel against his father. However, that rebellion was not to be, as he was swiftly assassinated by the Imperial Guard, likely at his father's command, who from that point on had not accepted any other bastards into the family. Now, finally, there's of course Martin, but his backstory and his story, like his father, are so extensive that I already made a full video on him, which is in the description, in case you wanted to learn more about him, or about Emperor Uriel.
And that's about all I can say about Emperor Uriel's children. Now, next up I want to talk to you about another topic that's very much present in the lore, but it's obscure and you'll have to dig a bit deeper for it to learn. And you have to play one of the hardest to play games in the series, the Elder Scrolls Travel Shadowkey, to fully grasp. It's the story of Tamriel's very own Berlin Wall situation, which takes place in the north of Hammerfell in a very specific city, the city of Dragonstar in the 3rd era, divided in east and west. So, the division of Dragonstar in East and West Dragonstar happened around the year 397 of the 3rd era, 2 years before the events of the Elder Scrolls 1 Arena, during the time when the Elder Scrolls Travel Shadowkey, the obscure Engage game, takes place. At this time, the antagonist of the Elder Scrolls 1 Arena, Jaeger Tharn, is in control over the Septim Empire, as he'd imprisoned Emperor Uriel Septim VII in a pocket realm of Oblivion, after which he magically disguised himself as the Emperor in order to rule over the Empire. For the full story on that, watch my video on Uriel Septim VII, and for the full Shadowkey story, watch my video on the Elder Scrolls Travel Shadowkey. Both are in the description of the video. Alright, so Jaeger Tharn's rule over Tamriel was marked by mismanagement and neglect, resulting in numerous regional conflicts as the Empire's vassal kingdoms clashed with each other all over Tamriel. The Imperial legions and diplomats who were supposed to maintain the peace, support diplomatic relations and prevent internal wars, essentially just stood by. Jaeger Tharn didn't seem particularly invested in stopping his vassals from fighting. This led to several regional wars across Tamriel, such as the 5-year war between the Bosmer clans and Valenwood's kingdoms against the Elsewhere Confederacy, the Arnesian War between Blackmarsh and Morrowind, and the War of the Blue Divide between the Somerset Isles and the clans and kingdoms of Valenwood, all within just a few years. The division of Dragonstar occurs in the midst of one such conflict, the War of Bender Mark. This war pitted the kingdoms of Skyrim against the Crown's faction of Hammerfell, who had allied with several High Rock kingdoms like Wayrest. Essentially, this conflict consisted of Skyrim launching an invasion into eastern Hammerfell, aiming to capture the cities of Elenir and Dragonstar, while also advancing into eastern High Rock to seize the city of Jahanna. To the north, these cities had originally been founded by Nordic settlers in earlier eras, were culturally aligned with Skyrim and even contained remnants of the ancient dragon cult, which indicated to the Nords that these lands thus belonged to them. Over the centuries, however, Skyrim had lost control over these regions, and when Skyrim became a part of the Septim Empire at the start of the Third Era, it no longer had the option of reclaiming these lands, as the Empire guaranteed the borders of its vassals. In other words, if Skyrim, an Imperial vassal, were to act aggressively towards Hammerfell or High Rock, also Imperial vassals, the Empire would intervene, and Skyrim would stand little chance against the combined force of these three powers. But with Jaeger Tharn on the throne, uninterested in maintaining borders, Skyrim noticed that other provinces were going to war without repercussions, so seizing the opportunity, Skyrim invaded eastern High Rock and eastern Hammerfell, capturing Elenir and Jahanna along with half of Dragonstar. Yes, only half of Dragonstar, because the offensive from Skyrim was eventually halted by the crowned Redguards of Hammerfell, when the conflict reached the city of Dragonstar, and the war in the region surrounding Dragonstar at least had settled into somewhat of a stalemate by the events of the Elder Scrolls Travel Shadowkey when we play in the region. You see, before the invasion by the Nords, Dragonstar as a city had already seems to have been divided into two districts, an eastern and a western district, with a wall already running through the city. When the Nords invaded, they managed to capture the eastern part of the city, but the western part of the city they failed to take, as the Redguards managed to hold on to the dividing wall. This made it so that the city got split into two, with the dividing wall forming the border between the two halves of the city. It's pretty clear that the developers got their inspiration by looking at the Berlin Wall, as just like with Berlin back during the Cold War, you can't just enter the other side of the city at will, rather you have to go through Nordic and Redguard military checkpoints in order to reach the other side of the city in the game. Now, of course, there's crucial differences between the city of Dragonstar and the city of Berlin in the real world. I mean, Berlin in the real world was in the midst of one of the two countries' territories, while Dragonstar was on the front lines. And of course, in Dragonstar, the dividing wall seems to have already been there. Meanwhile, in the real world, in Berlin, the wall was eventually built after the division of the city. But one striking similarity with the Berlin Wall is that, just like Berlin, Dragonstar in the lore has remained divided for several decades. During the Oblivion Crisis, so at the time of Oblivion, we know that the city was still divided about 30 years after the initial division, with, according to the Pocket Guide to the Empire at the time, there being a continued atmosphere of mistrust and fear in the city, as both sides, decades later, are still looking to conquer the other half, and with terrorist attacks by both sides taking place in the city. Hatred in the city seems to have mostly been directed towards the Nords during this time, who, after a military commission was sent by the Central Imperial government, which likely had to decide peace terms between the two sides, the Nords were seemingly allowed to keep a lot of the conquered territories by the diplomatic commission. It's likely that this commission was sent by Jaeger Tharn just before his defeat in the Elder Scrolls Arena, as at the time of the war, he wanted to get more of a hold and influence over Skyrim, meaning that the sending of a military commission favoring Skyrim would be something that Jaeger Tharn would do. Although it's also possible that the commission was sent by Emperor Uriel Septim VII after Jaeger Tharn's defeat, as Uriel might have simply seen the Nords would not just give up the territories, and perhaps the Imperial legions were too weak to do anything about it after years of Jaeger Tharn's mismanagement, so he just decided, alright Skyrim, you can keep it. Now, regardless how the end of the war was decided, this favorable deal for Skyrim meant that the overwhelming consensus in Hammerfell and High Rock was that they lost the war to the Nords, meaning that not just in Western Dragonstar, but all along the front lines of the War of Bender Mark, the Redguards and the Bretons remained bitter, desiring to take back the lands that they lost. However, with Imperial central control restored, there was not much that they could do about it, as for several decades the front lines of the War of Bender Mark became the new border between the Kingdom of Skyrim and the factions on the other side.
However, that seems to have ended in the year 15 of the 4th era, when the last leader of the Septim Empire, Potentate Okato, was assassinated and Tamriel was plunged into chaos when central command fell away, in a period called the Storm Crown Interregnum. It was during this period, before the restoration of the Imperial command under Emperor Titus Mede I, that Hammerfell and High Rock were seemingly able to restore the old borders, reunite the city of Dragonstar and bring the conquered territories back under the previous management, as by the year 201 of the 4th era, at the time of Skyrim, there is no mention of Eastern Dragonstar or any of the other territories still being part of Skyrim.
And that's about all I can say about Tamriel's Berlin Wall situation and the War of Bender Mark. Definitely one of my favorite subjects that I covered over the past few years. Now, next up, let's talk about an obscure figure in the Elder Scrolls lore, which is kind of in the background of the lore of the Elder Scrolls games before and up to Oblivion, Emperor Pelagius Septim IV. The father of Emperor Uriel Septim VII, the emperor that we see in many of the early games, and the grandfather of Martin Septim, and previous emperor of Tamriel before his son, Emperor Uriel Septim VII, took over. So, Emperor Pelagius Septim IV, the 20th ruler of the Septim Empire. He was the father of Emperor Uriel Septim VII, and he ruled Tamriel for 29 years from the year 339 of the 3rd era until the year of his death, the year 368 of the 3rd era, when his son Uriel took the throne, taking on the ruling name Uriel Septim VII. Now, Pelagius Septim IV died relatively young at the age of 54, meaning that his rule could have been far longer, although we don't know the exact cause of his death, unfortunately. Although we do know that he came to the throne relatively young, at just the age of 25, and we know that his ascension to the Imperial throne was actually far from straightforward. In fact, at some point he was only 3rd or 4th, or maybe even 5th, depending on how you look at it, in the line of the Septim throne, and it was only through the misfortune of others that he ended up becoming emperor. You see, if we examine this little family tree, we can see that his ascension to the throne was in no way guaranteed, as when his grandfather, Emperor Uriel Septim V, the mad lad emperor who conquered most islands around Tamriel and even tried and failed to conquer Akavir, was in power, Pelagius wasn't even born yet, but there was already one uncle, one aunt and one mother ahead of him in the line of succession, and it suggested that his aunt may have had older children eventually, making him 4th or 5th in line to the Septim throne. However, when Emperor Uriel Septim V went to Akavir for a military campaign to conquer the continent and hugely overstretched his supply lines and the capabilities of his armies, he ended up dying in the attempted invasion of the continent. Now, the details of this whole military disaster overseas is not actually relevant for the topic of this video, so if you want to know more about that failed invasion of Akavir, there's a video on the topic in the description. But what is important to know for this video is that when Emperor Uriel Septim V died in his attempt to conquer the continent, there was nothing to suggest that our Emperor Pelagius would ever ascend to the throne, as 1, he wasn't born yet, and 2, there were 2 people ahead of him in the line of succession that would make sure that he probably would never ascend to the throne. 1, his uncle, Emperor Uriel Septim VI, who was the oldest child of Emperor Uriel Septim V, and who was actually only a child when his father died in Akavir, and his aunt Moriata, who was next in line, and then his mother Eloisa, who was 3rd in line. Because even though these 2 daughters of Emperor Uriel V were apparently twins, it seems that Moriata was the oldest of the 2, so, came out first. This would make it pretty unlikely that Pelagius would ever ascend to the throne, but in order to understand why he eventually landed on the throne, we need to delve into a little bit of Imperial history. You see, the empire at the time of his uncle, so Uriel Septim VI, ascension to the throne was a very much scattered and divided empire. Civil wars years earlier had made sure that imperial control over some provinces and many of the vassal kingdoms was very weak, and this was not really helped by the fact that his grandfather, Uriel V, who instead of fixing the empire's internal issues decided to just focus on military campaigns to expand the empire, didn't really try to solve all these issues. In addition to that, his uncle Uriel VI was a child emperor when he ascended to the throne, and we know what that means. That means that the nobility of the empire, in the form of the Elder Council and even his own mother Thonica, simply tried to grab as much power as they could, while Uriel VI simply played with his toys. This meant that when Uriel VI came of age, he had to fight a long and hard fight against the Elder Council, his own mother and the other nobility in order to become top dog in the empire. It took some years, but with the help of his sisters, who were fiercely loyal to him, Uriel VI did manage to wrest power over the empire back from the nobility and put it back firmly in his own hands. But even then, once he had power over the empire was crumbling, as vassals were rejecting imperial rule left and right.
Something had to happen, so Uriel VI started a hard campaign to try and bring central rule back and strengthen the Imperial government's position. But then he died. He fell off his horse and he could not be saved, so he died, before he even could produce an heir. Meaning that the throne went to his oldest sibling, his sister, Moriata. Now, Moriata as an empress continued the work of her brother in trying to unite Tamriel under a stronger central imperial rule, and she succeeded. In the 25 years that she reigned, she quelled many rebellions and proved herself to be a wise and cautious ruler who carefully picked her battles. Now, over the course of her reign, her sister, so Pelagius' mother, Eloisa, died somewhere after Pelagius' birth, meaning that as long as Moriata did not have any children, Pelagius, being her little nephew, would be first in line to the throne. Now, we don't really know the status of Moriata's children. In fact, the Pocket Guide to the Empire mentions that she has no surviving children, which suggests that she may have had children at some point, but that they died somewhere along the way, meaning that when she died, due to a tragic assassination, Pelagius, who had been very far down the line of succession initially, was first in line for the throne when his aunt died. Now, the empire that Pelagius inherited from his aunt was more unified than it had been for centuries, but there still were many problems and rebellions to solve before it could truly be called united. So, when Pelagius ascended to the throne as Emperor Pelagius Septim IV, he continued his aunt's work of quelling the rebellions and restoring imperial authority. In the end, he ended up making less progress than his aunt had done, with most of the easy rebellions being quelled by her, meaning that he was left with some hard nuts to crack. But despite this, he made steady progress, and his rule would come to be known as one of the most prosperous and peaceful rules of the Septim dynasty, as it was devoid of any major incidents and the economy flourished, while the empire slowly stabilized into a more centralized state. He worked tirelessly to make the empire more prosperous. He worked on infrastructure like roads to make provinces better connected socially and economically to the heartland, and generally proved to be a calm and capable ruler, even trying to build a road through Blackmarsh, something that previous emperors had tried and failed, but he at least partially seems to have succeeded. For all terms and purposes, Pelagius Septim IV was actually kind of a boring emperor, as he just slowly whittled away at making the empire stronger and more prosperous, with no major incidents taking place. I mean, there probably were incidents, and we know that there were a few rebellions and secessions that he had to fight hard with, but there was no big catastrophe like the Oblivion Crisis, the Red Year, or the Dragon Crisis that later rulers would be confronted with. It was just a relatively good time. Now, we don't really know what led to the end of his rule, but what we do know is that upon his death at the age of 55, the empire was the most united that it had ever been, with his son Uriel Septim VII essentially being handed the keys to a relatively stable empire. Now, before I end this video, I want to do a little bit of analysis, because we know that Pelagius IV died relatively early at the age of 54, while some other emperors in the Septim dynasty, like his son Uriel Septim VII, managed to rule until a very old age. It's not unthinkable actually that under any other circumstances, Pelagius Septim IV could have reached the age of 75 under different circumstances, as that seems to be a very realistic age for a Tamrielic emperor in peaceful times. Now, stay with me here for a second, because his son, Uriel VII, when he came to power, relied heavily on a certain advisor to teach him the ropes of ruling, an advisor who became extremely powerful in the 20 years after Pelagius IV's death. That advisor was Jagar Tharn, the individual that would betray Emperor Uriel Septim VII, imprison him in oblivion while secretly taking over the empire's reign himself, while disguising himself as the emperor. It's actually not unthinkable that if Pelagius had lived longer, the entire plot of the Elder Scrolls Arena, with Jagar Tharn impersonating the Emperor and letting the Empire fall apart in regional wars, would not have happened, and that a lot of trouble like the War of Bender Mak and the War of the Blue Divide and several other regional wars would not have happened and would not have weakened the Empire, possibly leaving the Empire stronger and better prepared for example, the Oblivion Crisis. Of course, that's just a thought experiment, but still, it's interesting to think about.
And that's about all I can say about Emperor Pelagius Septim IV. Now next up, let's talk about an aspect of the lore that's taking place right under our noses, just below the, let's call it, gameplay layer, specifically the other guilds of Tamriel. Of course, we have the playable guilds like the Fighters Guild and the Mages Guild, but in the lore there are actually quite a few other guilds active on Tamriel, and we'll talk about all of their lore right now. So, obscure guilds. Something you need to know is that most of the Tamriel-wide guilds, or at least Empire-wide guilds, got their start back in the Second Era with the signing of the so-called Guild Act, which famously brought the Mages Guild and Fighters Guild to life. The Guild Act was primarily meant to give the Fighters Guild an official role in the Tamrielic Empire as dependable mercenaries who could be hired to protect local cities and kingdoms. You see, back in the Second Era, under the rule of the first Akaviri Potentate, there were a lot of rebellions in the Empire, and the Potentate spent years campaigning with the Imperial legions to quell those rebellions. Now, during the height of all those rebellions, the Potentate instituted a new law which disbanded all local armies, with only city and town garrisons seemingly exempt from this law. Of course, this caused for a lot of unrest and even more rebellions, as local lords of the Empire refused to give up their standing armies. This led to a 37-year-long civil war within the Empire, in which the Akaviri Potentate used the Imperial legions to completely crush all local armies until the Imperial Legion, so the army of the central Imperial government, was the only serious fighting force left within the Empire's borders. However, this ultimate victory came at a big cost, as the bloody civil war had left Tamriel ravaged, and the lack of local standing armies gave bandits virtually free reign over much of the Empire's outer provinces, and the Imperial Legion was already spread too thinly to really deal with them. This is when the Guild Act was passed, a new law which sanctioned guilds in the Empire of certain professions that had to pay a certain percentage of their profits to the Imperial government in exchange for official Imperial recognition. The main objective of this law was the creation of the Fighters Guild as dependent Empire-wide mercenaries that the local lords could hire to deal with the bandits roaming around their land instead of having a standing army. But an unforeseen consequence of this act was the creation of many more guilds around Tamriel, which followed a similar model to the newly created Fighters Guild. While the Mages Guild is the biggest and most well-known example of this, we have many more. For example, there is the Merchants Guild, which loosely unites the merchants and shopkeepers of local towns, enforcing rules upon them such as universal opening times of their shops, and most likely also the prevention of pricing wars between competing merchants in the towns where the guild is active. You also have several guilds pertaining to the entertainment sectors of the Empire, such as the Actors Guild, which unites the actors of regions and which itself produces plays and seems to educate aspiring actors. The guild also recommends and reviews non-guild plays and performances for the public, and will even warn the public about really bad plays, although I can also see a bit of protectionism in that, as the guild might just negatively review almost anything made outside of the guild, but we don't have much evidence for that. Now, other than that, in the entertainment sector, you've also got the Minstrels Guild that we practically know nothing about, other than that it employs minstrels. And another very interesting guild that we know of is the Scenarists Guild, which interestingly is one of the few guilds that has operated around Tamriel since before the Guild Act. The Scenarists Guild has their own headquarters in an ancient citadel on the border between Hammerfell and Skyrim, and they mostly employ writers and historians, with a lot of cities having an outpost of the guild. The members of the Scenarists Guild in a city outpost are known to do research and write history volumes on the local area, but also offer their services to the local population and even to tourists, providing historical tours and lectures about the city that they reside in or the region that they reside in, when people want to learn about local history. Funnily enough, they also keep themselves busy by trying to solve riddles and puzzles, which is very cool, I guess. Now, kinda similar to them is the Scribes Guild, of whom we know next to nothing. However, if I had to guess, the Scribes Guild most likely unites local scribes that do administration, while the Scenarists Guild seems to be more like a historian's guild, if that makes sense. Now, next up we have a lot more traditional service professions that have their own guilds. So you've got a Cook's Guild, a Brewer's Guild, a Cobbler's Guild, a Labourer's Guild, a Tailor's Guild, a Weaver's Guild, a Vintner's Guild, an Astrologer's Guild, a Barrister's Guild, a Caravanier's Guild, a Mason's Guild, and a Tinker's Guild. Of many of those we know quite little. In fact, of the Cook's Guild we only know that they employ local cooks. Of the Cobbler's Guild we only know that they employ shoemakers. Of the Brewer's Guild we only know that they employ brewers. Of the Tailor's Guild we only know that they employ those who make clothes. The Vintner's Guild employs those who make wine. The Astrologer's Guild employs astrologers. The Barrister's Guild employs lawyers and other illegal experts. The Caravanier's Guild employs trading caravan owners and workers. The Masons Guild employs masons and other builders, and the Tinkers Guild employs those who work with tin. That's really all we know about them. The only one of those artisan guilds that we know a little bit more about is the Weavers Guild, and then specifically we know only about them that other than employing fabric makers, they were well known for producing the best quality fabrics around the continent, and that in some regions they had a near monopoly on the trade of fabrics.
That's all. Now, next to those mentioned guilds, we also have a Rat Catchers Guild. Pretty funny that you need a guild for that. And a Furriers Guild. Not a furry guild, but a Furriers Guild, which are fur merchants and those who can work with fur and are able to expertly clean fur clothing. Cool. Now, while everyone knows about the Mages Guild, we know that there were some very specific other magical guilds on Tamriel, which mostly provided a very specific magical service as opposed to the Mages Guild, which had a more broad mandate about magic. For example, you had the Healers Guild, which specifically employed healing mages, and we know that there were specific smaller guilds for alchemy, but we don't know anything about those unfortunately. Now, a guild we do know a bit more about is the so-called Bailiffs Guild, a guild which educated and united the bailiffs of the Empire. By the way, a bailiff, for those who don't know, were usually local officials that can have a various range of responsibilities in towns and cities, usually acting as a proxy for the local lord in administration and justice matters for the people of the town or the city. And I presume that through this guild one could likely become educated to become a bailiff and then keep in contact with others of the profession across many of the towns and cities of Tamriel. Now, some ex-members of this city actually appeared in the Elder Scrolls Online Thieves Guild DLC, meaning that actually Bethesda has not forgotten about all these obscure guilds. But other than that, we know, again, very little about this one. Now, a guild that we actually know a bit more of is the Prostitutes Guild, which I actually already talked about in my wider video on prostitution on Tamriel, which is in the description in case you want to know about it. Not a meme video, serious video. So check that out if you want to know more. Now, of the Prostitutes Guild, we know that it hires and protects the local sex workers of the different cities. Each chapter is led by a so-called guild mistress, and the guild does not just provide sexual services, but also apparently puts on large-scale dance and art shows and parades on large holidays, or at least in some of the bigger cities where they're active. Now, the final obscure guild that I want to talk about in this video is the Architects Guild. They employ architects across the Empire and apparently are somewhat uniformizing the building standards across the Empire. We also know that this guild is one of the bigger and better organized ones and is able to withstand large-scale civil wars with the parties at war, both trusting the guild to do work for them. Or perhaps they just have very little choice, as nearly every Tamrielic architect is apparently part of the guild. And that's about all I can say about the obscure guilds. Next up, let's talk about a guild that we know a little bit more of, the Dark Brotherhood. Specifically, let's talk about the mechanics behind the Dark Brotherhood. How does their Black Sacrament work, and what's the actual internal structure of the Brotherhood? Let's talk about it. So, Dark Brotherhood, assassins for hire who traditionally had sanctuary bases all across Tamriel and were able to kill anyone for the right price, at least before their fall in the mid-4th era. For more on that, watch my video on their full decline, or the story of the last listener before the Dragonborn. But if one wants to arrange a contract of assassination with the Dark Brotherhood, it's quite commonly known across Tamriel that a dark and profane ritual must be performed, after which an assassin will show up to take your contract. Although the exact details of that profane ritual don't seem to be extremely common knowledge across the continent, and can only be learned on Tamriel through word of mouth or highly looked down upon and sometimes outright illegal books. But let's say you want to assassinate someone and you happen to have found a description or heard an exact description of how to perform this profane ritual, which is called the Black Sacrament. How exactly does this process work which gets an assassin to you? Well, first, you need to perform the Black Sacrament ritual. That ritual is performed by creating a symbolic version of your target on the floor, an effigy, assembled from actual body parts, and you must include a heart, a skull, some bones, and some human flesh, although often the entire skeleton of a human is used. It doesn't really seem to matter how you got these, or who they belong to. What matters is that you use them to create a symbolic effigy of your target on the floor. An interesting question here is, would you need an Argonian's body parts if you want an Argonian assassinated, or a High Elf for a High Elf, and so on? We don't know, although I think it most likely doesn't really matter, as this effigy does not need to resemble the victim literally, it seems. It's more of a symbol for your future victim, if you know what I mean. Although we don't really know anything beyond that. Now, when you've done that, you need to surround this effigy of your victim with candles, which you then need to light. This setup will be the base for the ritual. You will then need to participate in the ritual yourself after this, as you need to fetch a dagger, and that dagger's blade then needs to be rubbed in nightshade flower petals, so the petals of a flower that's often used in assassin's poisons. You then need to kneel in the circle and use the dagger to repeatedly stab the effigy while proclaiming the words of the ritual. Sweet mother, send your child unto me, for the sins of the unworthy must be baptized in blood and fear. Now, this ritual opens a one-way spiritual connection to the Night Mother, the preserved corpse of the woman who once seems to have founded the Dark Brotherhood, at least in most legends, and whose spirit has become immortal and has since been seen as the unholy bride of Sithis, the Lord of the Void in the primordial chaos. It's believed that her status as a matron half-deity to the Dark Brotherhood is provided through Sithis' power, and that it's thus through Sithis' power that this unholy spiritual connection to the Night Mother is established when performing the Black Sacrament. Now, as most people who have played either Skyrim or Oblivion know, the Night Mother's spirit will then speak to the Dark Brotherhood. Specifically, her spirit speaks to one member, the so-called a Listener, a Dark Brotherhood assassin who's been chosen by the Night Mother to form an unholy spiritual bond with her, which will then allow them to hear her voice. She will then speak to the Listener the name and location of someone who performed a Black Sacrament. Now, the Listener, who is part of the Dark Brotherhood's leadership, and often has the most important say in the leadership, being the one relaying the words of their unholy matron, then reveals to the leadership of the Brotherhood the names and locations of these potential clients. Now, the leadership of the Brotherhood, which is called the Black Hand, is a group of 5 highly ranked assassins, each of whom represent a finger of the hand, hence the Black Hand, with the Listener taking the symbolic position of the thumb, and the other 4 members taking the title of Speaker and symbolizing the remaining fingers. So the Listener relays the names and locations to the speakers, and each speaker, from what I've been able to infer, seems to have their own kind of territory and will travel between different Brotherhood sanctuaries across Tamriel, although sometimes the speaker does seem to lead their own sanctuary on the side, which seems to me like 2 jobs which are impossibly hard to juggle at the same time, but some have seemingly been able to make it work. Alright, now generally the Listener will select a speaker for every name and location of a client that they heard. So the speaker who handles, let's say, northwestern Cyrodiil, High Rock and Hammerfell will get the names and locations for the clients in those provinces. The one responsible for northeastern Cyrodiil, Skyrim and Morrowind gets the names and locations there. The one responsible for southern Cyrodiil, Blackmarsh and elsewhere gets the names there, and the ones responsible for Somerset and Valenwood gets theirs. Now, a little side note, I completely made up those divisions, but they seem like they work well logistically when you consider that the Listener is often based in Breville, where the Night Mother is buried. But these territory divisions are just speculation on my end, so take it with a pinch of salt. That being said, what happens next is that the speaker will generally travel to the different sanctuaries in their territories, depending on the type and importance of the client and the contract. They may choose to select the assassin who will contract the client and arrange the assassination themselves, or they may leave the names and locations on the desks of the head of the local sanctuary, who will then distribute the contracts among their assassins. Or, in some cases, a speaker may use their own personal assassin, a so-called silencer, who works not for a sanctuary but directly for a speaker to carry out the contract. Which of these options is chosen seems to be up to the speaker. I imagine that stuff like importance of the client, difficulty of the contract, time constraints for the contract and other logistical factors probably play a part in determining who is selected for the contract and whether or not the speaker themselves or a sanctuary head assigns it, although it definitely seems to trend towards important and difficult contracts often being carried out by the silencers and distributed directly by the speaker to experienced assassins, while easier contracts and contracts of lesser importance are often left to the discretion of sanctuary leaders, with stuff like contracts on beggars and commoners with little protection often being distributed by sanctuary leaders to low-ranking assassins, and high-profile nobles with a lot of protection being assassinated by experienced and high-ranking assassins or speaker silencer. Also, considering the lore size of Tamriel being far bigger than the game size, being around the size of Europe apparently, this all would mean that the Black Hand are either mostly just on the road all the time, traveling to and from the different sanctuaries, or as the Elder Scrolls Legends, the now defunct card game, suggests, with their Black Hand messenger card, it's possible that perhaps the Black Hand also have their own messengers which they send ahead to the sanctuaries for contracts to prevent themselves being on the road all the time. Although again, that's mostly speculation. Now, that being said, once a point of contact is given to an assassin, they are generally the ones to approach the client and ask for details on the contract, after which the assassin is expected to take out the target. Although sometimes that contact with the client is first handled by another member of the Brotherhood or by the speakers themselves, again probably depending on the logistics and difficulty of the contract, and then the assassin is only used to assassinate the target and gets little face-to-face time with the client. It really depends on the type of work. Either way, the assassin will then kill your target, and upon completion you pay either the assassin or a representative of the Brotherhood, and then everyone lives happily ever after. Except for that person you had assassinated. They are dead, and their soul is in the void with the Dreadlord Sithis. A very unhappy fate, actually. Oh, and you probably feel guilty about it, and yeah, the family and friends of the person you had assassinated are probably very sad, so please don't use the Dark Brotherhood or any similar thing in real life. However, when you look past that, there is one more interesting thing to mention here. As in the 4th era, when the Night Mother refused to speak to anyone for more than a decade and the Dark Brotherhood nearly got destroyed, again watch my dedicated video for that full story, there was one Dark Brotherhood sanctuary which did manage to survive. Astrid's Falkreath Sanctuary that we join in Skyrim, of course. Now, the way they went about it is that without the connection to the Night Mother and with the Black Hands having completely fallen apart and being non-functional, what they did was keep their ears very close to the ground and basically see if they can hear any rumors around the province of people trying to contact the Brotherhood. When there are rumors of someone trying to do so, they see if they can find proof of their attempted Black Sacrament and make contact. It's a quite inefficient way of working, but it's one that kept a small band of Dark Brotherhood assassins employed for quite some time, so still it's interesting.
Anyway, that's about all I can say about how the Black Sacrament works. Next up, let's talk about a subject that has been a fascination for me since I first played Oblivion, and then again when Oblivion Remastered released. The Elder Council of the Empire. We can see their chambers of the Council in Oblivion, but how exactly does the Council function and work? Let's talk about it.
So, the Elder Council of Cyrodiil. As will become clear in this video, the council has served multiple purposes and has taken various shapes over the years, ever since its foundation back in the First Era during the Alessian Slave Rebellion. To give this video some structure, I will first talk about the council as we see it in the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, where we can actually see the council chambers and where we learn quite a bit about how it functions from both the game and from the lore. Then after that I will talk a bit about the council's origins and the different forms it has taken over the years and some historical developments. And finally I will end with a bit of speculation on what the council may look like and who may be on it during the 4th era. So, the 3rd era. Under the Septims, that's the first one. Now, by the time we actually see the council chambers in the 3rd era in the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, it is formally a council made up of people who were directly appointed by the Emperor or Empress and advise the Emperor on policy matters. Meaning that there are people from around the Empire in it with a lot of political experience, a lot of political influence or other valuable qualities to aid the Emperor. There were 30 members, seemingly, in the 3rd era, as there are 30 chairs in the Elder Council chambers, but that might not be the full story, as High Chancellor Okato mentions both an inner council, which does the day-to-day tasks, and then a full council, which is convened after the Oblivion crisis in the lore, meaning that there may be far more members than 30, if that 30 is just the inner council which runs the day-to-day operations. Anyway, during the Septim days, their official task was to manage the policy details of the Emperor in his name, within the framework as established by the Emperor. The Emperor would make policy decisions, and then the Council, in the leadership of their chairman, the High Chancellor, drafts laws in detail and administers taxes throughout the Empire within the Emperor's framework and allocates budget for projects just such as infrastructure, with the Emperor holding a veto over everything if the Council does something in his name that he does not like. So, as a concrete example, the Emperor could say, "We need to improve the infrastructure connecting Cyrodiil to Valenwood." And then the Elder Council, with its policy experts appointed by the Emperor himself, chooses which roads to improve, which people to hire, etc. If the Emperor disagrees with what the Council does, for example if the Council chooses to invest in water infrastructure by digging a new canal after he said that the infrastructure needs to be improved, but the Emperor wants to build a road, then the Emperor can veto the Council's decision and instruct them to build a road instead, or take control of the process himself if he doesn't trust the Council to do its job correctly. As such, the Council functions as a sort of modern-day cabinet of ministers of sorts to the Septim Emperor, and they are supposed to vote on new emperors to accept their legitimacy as they ascend to the throne. This is supposed to be essentially just a rubber stamp of confirmation, so a routine confirmation of the new emperor, but that's just officially. Because unofficially, the Elder Council is more than simply an aid to the Emperor, and they often have great power in selecting the new Emperor. While advising the new emperor is officially their task, the council tends to have a lot of political power, and during the Septim days it was often a political power struggle between the council and the emperor. You see, during the Septim days a lot of the politically powerful people of the empire found their way onto the council, and sometimes it was hard for the emperor to dismiss council members who had been on it since the times of their grandfather, as often council members, once appointed by an emperor, would be kept on by the next emperor, and their combined influences of these long-term magistrates could sometimes overshadow young emperors, meaning that the council could sometimes wrest a lot of influence from the emperor. For example, Empress Katerina, who was a Dunmer, never truly felt accepted by the council and traveled a lot throughout the empire to solve local problems and be away from the council who just tried to bully her. But this meant that the council ran the empire as a whole in her absence and gathered a lot of power for itself, meaning that her children inherited an empire that they could barely run, as the council would be able to overrule the emperor on almost everything, with now the emperor being the rubber stamp on the council's legislation rather than the other way around. Now, during the Septim days, an interesting case was that of Emperor Uriel VI. You see, Uriel VI was crowned a boy emperor at a very young age, and the council essentially ruled in his behalf for his entire youth. A power that the council would very much like to retain, as they could rule essentially without impunity. By the time Uriel VI came of age, however, the council had stripped the office of the emperor of so much power that the only thing that the emperor still could decide on was whether to veto council decisions or not. You see, the council was able to appoint emperors and even disinherit complete branches of the Septim family of the throne if they didn't like that branch of the family, thus essentially just choosing their own emperor. But Uriel VI was quite a clever emperor, as he used his vetoes in a strategic way and used the Imperial family funds to bribe and bully the council into submission, until after 6 years of power struggle he'd vetoed, bullied, bribed, and basically married off some of his siblings to strategic allies until the council was in complete submission to him and he was able to rule Tamriel as a despot after basically 6 years. He was able to do this because in the Septim days the Emperor commanded a certain divine authority, because the Emperor was the only one able to light the dragon fires and protect Tamriel from the dangers of oblivion. Because of this, the council could not ignore an Emperor's veto, and thus Uriel VI was able to take back control by exploiting his status and veto. This is important to remember, as when non-dragonborn emperors ascended the throne, such as the Longhouse emperors from the 2nd era or the Mead emperors from the 4th era, the dynamic with the Elder Council kinda changes, as instead of a divine ruler, the council now battles a mortal man for influence, which, as we will see, changes the game a bit. But I'm getting ahead of myself, as that is another quite interesting case to talk about. You see, during the early Septim days, 82 years after the founding of the empire by Tiber Septim and only like 40 years after his death, Emperor Pelagius Septim II rose to the throne. A lot of people on the council at that time were still people who'd been there likely during the reign of Tiber Septim himself, as it only been like 38 or 40 years. But the empire was in debt, and Pelagius II used this right of appointment of the council to dismiss the entire council, which was filled with wise advisors, some from, again, Tiber Septim's day, likely, and instead allowed only people who were willing to pay large sums of money to the imperial treasury to serve as his advisors on the Elder Council. As such, he solved the empire's monetary issue, but he plunged the empire into an era with increased mismanagement, as the people with a lot of money weren't necessarily the people able to run the empire in the best possible ways. I want to tell these examples to show you how the Elder Council, while it has a charter outlining its official duties, has had different levels of influence and power over the years. When the Emperor is powerful, it could just be a rubber stamp and an advisory organ, or it could be a cabinet of sorts if the Emperor decides to use it in that way, or even a tool to get money out of the rich. While when the Emperor is weak, the Council is able to exploit this and exploit its own position and rule the Empire without impunity. But it's a constant power struggle, essentially. However, over the course of its existence, the council has gotten an air of legitimacy to its power, and when the emperor is incompetent or when there are no legitimate heirs upon the death of an emperor, the council is able to assume power over the empire temporarily in a legitimate way and appoint regents and potentate rulers. Regents in the case of a really young emperor, and potentate rulers in the case of there being no heirs. Something interesting to note here is that when Martin Septim sacrificed himself at the end of Oblivion and the Empire was left without an emperor, we saw how the Empire did need an emperor or figurehead at least to keep the Empire together. You see, we saw that the council kept seeking an emperor to keep the empire together, to the point that they appointed High Chancellor Okato as potentate, who reluctantly accepted the position because he saw that they needed a figurehead and he was the only one with enough authority and enough respect by everyone to be accepted as the sole ruler. I made a video on him some years ago, so watch that video if you want to know more about High Chancellor Okato. You see, this illustrates that while the council loves to rule without the limitations of a powerful emperor, it cannot function without an emperor or potentate as figurehead to keep the empire from tearing itself apart, and as a central point of authority essentially. As when such a unifying figure is killed, either an emperor or a potentate, nobody really has enough influence to claim the throne, or there are no heirs. At that point the empire just collapses and we get interregnums where everybody is fighting over power and influence, neglecting the provinces, which often leads to the empire just falling apart. For an example of such an interregnum, we have the Storm Crown interregnum, which is a period of infighting between the death of High Chancellor Okato and the ascension of Emperor Titus Mede. I also made a video on that, which is in the description if you want to know more, just like the video on High Chancellor Okato. Anyway, let's talk a bit about the origins of the Elder Council. Now, we know that the council was first established during the days of Empress Alessia, founder of the First Cyrodiilic Empire, after she and her fellow humans rebelled against the Ayleid elves who had kept humans as slaves. Alessia would rule as empress after this slave rebellion, and we know that her son, Belharsen the Man-Bull, the only known Minotaur emperor of the empire, succeeded her, and his coronation was confirmed by the Elder Council, which had already been formed at that point to advise Alessia during her reign. With that, the council's position of confirming the new emperor next to the dragonfires being lit was started. An interesting bit of speculation about the origins of the Elder Council is that at this time it was likely a group of rulers and vassals from around the kingdom, or the empire at that point, who hailed from a certain territory in the Alessian Empire and then just came to advise the empress on their territories and pledge loyalty to her. What's interesting is that in the early Alessian Empire, many of the vassal kingdoms which made up the empire were Ayleid kingdoms which betrayed their brethren and worked with humans in their slave rebellion, either because they also abhorred slavery or because they hoped to survive the conflict. This means that of the early Elder Council, it's quite likely that part of the council was made up of Ayleid kings, which is pretty interesting in my opinion. Now, another interesting bit is that when King Reman Cyrodiil founded the Reman Empire, or the Second Empire, with the help of the Akaviri invaders, which had bowed to him after the battle at Pale Pass, he allowed many of those Akaviri invaders on the Elder Council as his advisors, and there was a large Akaviri faction on the council, with the High Chancellor and Imperial Battle Mage being an Akaviri who, with the help of the Elder Council, even became potentate after the line of the Reman Emperors ended. For more about that story, see my video on Akaviri Potentate vs Duché. I know that there's a lot of video plugs in this video, but the video would be far too long. I've had to make whole diversions, but those are very interesting things to learn about, so check the description for videos on those topics, like for example also that Minotaur Emperor that I mentioned earlier. Anyway, a final bit of interest is that when the Longhouse Emperor Durkarak the Black Drake, which was a Reachman chieftain who conquered Cyrodiil, when he came to power after a long interregnum in which the council had gone defunct, he reinstated the council as an advisory body in order to embrace Cyrodiilic culture and to avoid getting the image of a barbarian conqueror. This means that acceptance from the council, even if the conqueror himself formed the council, can mean a lot for the legitimacy of an emperor, especially when that emperor is not a dragonborn emperor and thus does not have the divine right to rule. That actually brings us to the Fourth Era, as the Mede Emperors, who we see in Skyrim for example, also have to deal with the Elder Council. You see, the Stormcrown Interregnum, which started after the death of Potentate Okato, was ended when Titus Mede I came to power by conquering the Imperial city, reportedly with less than 1,000 men, after the empire had become extremely weak after a lot of infighting in both the council and outside of the council, with a lot of people pretending to, be the rightful heir to the throne while they weren't. And then we had a lot of pretender emperors and, well, watch the video on the Stormcrown Interregnum. Then on the council there was a man named Hirem, who was an influential member in the Elder Council which had still existed by that point, be it very fractured. He was the one who convinced the Elder Council to accept Titus Mede as a liberator from the chaos rather than a conqueror, which the council then voted to accept him as the new emperor, and order and stability was eventually returned to Cyrodiil and later the empire. But Titus Mead wasn't a Dragonborn Emperor, and from the Elder Scrolls novels, The Infernal City and Lord of Souls, we know that the Elder Council has a bit of a different position compared to the past. You see, under the Meads, it seems that the Council has become more of a parliament which votes on the Empire's legislation, which is made up of vassal kings and queens, influential merchants, heads of organizations, and others who control parts of the Empire. The Council no longer seems to deal with policy, as the Meads actually have ministers, something which we hadn't heard about before. Like, they have a prime minister and a minister of war, which the Septims didn't seem to have. Those ministers now seem to take on the policy details, like which the council used to do in the Septim days, and those ministers are also appointed by the Emperor himself and run the Empire, while the council is more of a representative parliament who vote on laws and bring their local issues to the Emperor's attention. This would make sense, as in order to sustain an empire not based on divine rule like the Septims, the Meads would have to take on more input from their vassals in order to keep the empire together and keep everybody happy, as they no longer have the lighting of the dragonfires and their divine right to rule as a sort of trump card to demand everybody's loyalty. Now, in order to get loyalty from their vassals, they would have to listen to them and give them more of a say, and as such, this system where the emperor's power is based on consent from vassals and not divine rule, which I derived from little hints we get in the novels and in Skyrim, makes a lot of sense in my opinion.
And that's about all that we know about how the Elder Council functions in canon, at least. Now, next up, let's talk about a faction that we primarily see in Oblivion and that, at least me during my first playthrough, never fully understood: the Moth Priests. What do they do? Who are they? And what's their function? Let's talk about it.
Alright, so before we can talk about the cult of the Ancestor Moth, we need to cover the moth that the entire cult is based on. In short, ancestor moths, also known as gypsy moths, are indigenous creatures to so-called ancestral glades across Tamriel, which mainly appear in the Geralt Mountains in Cyrodiil, but also in rare other places across Tamriel. The byproduct of these moths is called ancestor silk. This is a special type of silk that the Nibonese Imperials living in northern Cyrodiil traditionally used for crafting and trading. Items made with ancestor silk were sacred to the Nibonese in ancient times, and they collected the ancestor silk by harnessing the song and hymnal vocals of their ancestors through the ancestor moths. This special silk gathering ritual dates back to the very early Nibonese and Cyrodiilic history. Now, there are many reasons for why the Nibonese people take such a pride in revering the ancestor moth and using their silk. For one, wearing clothes and armor made out of ancestral silk lends them a certain sense of unity with their ancestral spirits. Furthermore, it's said that the ancestor moths continuously house or carry the spirits of their ancestors, an ability that supposedly grants wisdom and knowledge to the living. However, many of these ancient traditions seem to have faded in modern Nibonese society, as Cyrodiil became more cosmopolitan and the heart of empires. Now, how does the cult of the ancestor moth factor into all of this? Well, you see, this order, which has the god Julianos as its patron deity, was created to preserve, study and utilize the ancient magics that ancestor moths emit and keep the ancient customs alive in a sense. The moth priests venerate the ancestors, believing that the wisdom of the ancestors can sing the future into present. However, after a while of studying the ancestor moths, it was likely discovered that through these moths, skilled priests of the order gain the ability to read the Elder Scrolls, an act regular mortals can only dream of doing. Priests do this through the ritual of the ancestor moth, a ritual that requires precise preparation and immense focus. The ritual can only be performed at so-called ancestral glades that contain canticle trees which attract the ancestor moths. Priests use a drawing knife to cut the bark of a canticle tree. Removing the bark attracts the ancestor moths to the tree, and with enough moths present in the glade, the priest attempting to read the Elder Scrolls gains a second type of sight through the presence of the moths. The role of the moths in this is to serve as a conduit of ancient magic that the priest then uses to decipher the scroll. Except for higher-born mortals like Tiber Septim or the Last Dragonborn, moth priests are the only ones who are taught to coherently interpret the harmony of the Elder Scrolls that they're reading. Although every moth priest is taught how to perform the ritual of the ancestor moth, very few ever end up performing it. You see, the ritual takes immense resilience and practice to be able to interpret and understand the harmony of the scrolls, which is why most moth priests never get the chance to perform it. Moreover, it can take months or even years for priests to decipher one single Elder Scroll. Naturally, magical exertion of that proportion takes a toll on the eyes of the moth priests, eventually rendering them blind. However, due to the gravity involved in being able to read an Elder Scroll, going blind from reading an Elder Scroll is considered a privilege and honor in the Order, as that would mean that they've served their purpose to help deciphering the scrolls, which are fragments of creation which allow mortals to gain glimpses into the past, possible futures and the present. The Moth Priest's motivation for reading the Elder Scrolls vary. The cult is commonly known for helping the Emperors of Cyrodiil foresee vague interpretations of future events on Tamriel, guiding them in their rule by offering glimpses of possible futures which may help them establish policies or make decisions. The structure of the information present in an Elder Scroll is very intricate and vague, and they're quite literally fragments of time and space that change constantly. Therefore, it's likely that a Moth Priest may never fully decipher and document everything in an Elder Scroll, simply because it always changes and because it's in some cases unknowable. However, their skill in reading the Elder Scrolls and the wisdom that even small glimpses into the future can offer, or at least possible futures, has on more than one occasion helped the forces of good in Tamriel. Moth Priest Dexian Avacus's intervention in Skyrim's Dawnguard DLC, for example, is a great example of how useful their knowledge and skills can be. As for who founded the Order of the Ancestor Moth, that's not entirely clear. The best estimates that we have put the founding of the Order near the end of the First Era or perhaps beginning of the Second Era, during the time of the Reman Empire, as our records of the Order begin around this time period. But we do know that alongside gaining the ability to read the Elder Scrolls, the Moth Priests are also functioning as the Scroll Keepers of the Empire. As Scroll Keepers, the cult is tasked with making sure that the Elder Scrolls are kept safe in the Imperial Library. Keeping the Elder Scrolls safe though is not a simple task, as there are artifacts that tend to appear and just disappear on their own, and not even the cult themselves know how many Elder Scrolls they have in their possession at one given moment. Besides that, powerful entities across Tamriel always tend to want to get their hands on them, which is yet another variable that the Order has to deal with, as many would like to steal the scrolls for their glimpses into possible futures. However, without proper training, these adversaries would have very little use for many of the scrolls, something that not many seem to understand. Now, moving on, the Order has a very specific ranking system, with most ranks complementing the other ranks. And to give a short overview, the Order has Initiates, Scroll Drudges, Adepts, Abbots and Augurs. Initiates are members that usually take care of retired blind Moth Priests at the Temple of the Ancestor Moths in the Gerald Mountains, which is a sort of retreat where blind Moth Priests are taken care of after having performed their duties all their lives. Initiates also go through training for Elder Scrolls readings in hope that one day they are able to read the Elder Scrolls, although very few in the Order ever attain that ability and have the gift. Now, if an Initiate shows the promise of being able to read an Elder Scroll, they may become an Adept in the Order. Adepts are priests who have the gift to read the Elder Scrolls. Now, many of these Adepts also fulfill different roles, such as becoming Abbots who lead the Ancestor Moth monasteries, and Augurs who are priests who can naturally attract Ancestor Moths. Although those last few roles can also be performed by priests who do not get the ability for reading an Elder Scrolls, just like the rank of Scroll Drudge, which is tasked with retrieving scrolls from the Imperial Library for librarians, which is also a role that can be performed without a gift, as librarians are in charge of the library housing the Elder Scrolls and do not tend to read the scrolls themselves. As such, even members who turn out not to have the gift serve important roles in the Order, and all members can help protect the scrolls and other members, as every member of the Order also learns a specific martial art called the Way of the Peaceful Fist, which can be used to floor those who threaten older priests of the Order and try to steal the Elder Scrolls. To be honest, this martial art may not be much, but it's often enough for the priests to protect themselves and the Order's blind priests. If you want to know more about the Way of the Peaceful Fist and other martial arts on Tamriel, by the way, I recommend watching my video on Tamrielic martial arts, which is in the description of this video. Now, moving on, members can also be grouped based on how good they are able to read the Elder Scrolls, and whether or not they have the gift. There are 4 of these groups: the Knave, the Unguarded Intellect, the Meditated Understanding and the Illuminated Understanding. If a Knave tries to read an Elder Scroll, all they see are odd letters and symbols, meaning that they do not have the gift to become a proper scroll-reading Moth Priest. An Unguarded Intellect can learn from and read an Elder Scroll, but they aren't resilient enough to counter the mind-shattering effects of an Elder Scroll, rendering them blind immediately upon first reading it and sometimes damage their sanity. However, they can still learn a piece of hidden knowledge as a price for their immediate blindness. The final and last 2 groups are resilient enough to read an Elder Scroll for prolonged amounts of time. This allows them to extract more information, but their vision still fades the more they read. Through proper understanding, meditation, training and natural resilience, certain members can reach meditated understanding and illuminated understanding status. Still, there's no guarantee that an initiate may not immediately go blind, even if they devoted themselves to a decade of isolated meditation and interpretation practice, especially if they don't have the natural aptitude or the gift. Now, as I mentioned before, the vision of a scroll-reading priest may fade gradually, but what they lack in vision they eventually make up for with elevated mental fortitude and a greater understanding of how to interpret the scrolls and read their language. Although this is a completely mental understanding, as when they translate the runes and they try to read everything down, that's just futile, as it turns out that while they were reading and writing they just wrote down gibberish which they can only understand in their mind and not if they write it down directly, so they have to interpret it themselves and translate it themselves. Since the message of an Elder Scroll cannot be fit on paper, as the only tangible message an Elder Scrolls leaves is in the spirit and the soul, which can then be interpreted but never directly told. Now, at some point in a scroll reading Moth priest's life, the Elder Scroll that they're reading will inform the priest in some way that the next reading that they undertake shall be their last, and this last reading is what the Order usually calls the ultimate reading. Priests usually isolate themselves before this to reflect on their life and prepare for their last revelation. Permanent blindness always follows the last revelation, but a priest who survives all of this tends to gain a higher understanding of life and can describe the information revealed to him in great detail. Lastly, every priest acknowledges that the prophecies that they've seen aren't set in stone. The Order claims that the Elder Scrolls don't hold prophecies until they actually come to pass. To put it simply, the priests gain insight into theoretic events that could come to pass, although no one is sure that they're actually going to happen. If you want to know more about that and how the Elder Scrolls function, I recommend watching this video I did on why the Elder Scrolls are so important and why they aren't at the same time. I explain everything there. Now, regarding the Order's involvement throughout Tamrielic history, they are usually just screwed over by a faction or group that wants what they protect, the Elder Scrolls. Their job to protect the scrolls puts them at the mercy of all three major factions that fought in the Alliance War in the Second Era, for example. These factions, the Daggerfall Covenant, Ebonheart Pact and the Altmerry Dominion, raided the Order, murdering their priests and taking 2 Elder Scrolls each. Future priests would later conclude that this raid had to happen because of how the Elder Scrolls influenced the choices of the aforementioned factions. Choices like that likely aligned with the prophecies in the Elder Scrolls that they managed to glimpse, although we will never actually be sure. Next up, the Order was also involved in the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion's Thieves Guild questline, where the player, as the Grey Fox, steals an Elder Scroll from the Imperial Palace from the Moth Priest's library. The last major event that the Cult of the Ancestor Moth was loosely involved in was in the Dawnguard questline in Skyrim. The Order became involved in this because in the year 175 of the 4th Era, 26 years before the events of Skyrim and the Dawnguard questline, the Elder Scrolls disappeared from the Imperial Library, leaving the Order in complete disarray as they no longer had any scrolls to study. Upon hearing a rumor that one Elder Scroll had been found in Skyrim, the cult sends the Moth Priest, Daxian Avacus, to Skyrim. Fortunately, Daxian is a Moth Priest who has the gift to read an Elder Scroll, and he can actually help the Last Dragonborn stop the Volkihar clan, which are the enemies on that questline, or the allies depending on your choices, by reading an Elder Scroll, either voluntary or forced depending on which side of the conflict you chose. Now, it's safe to say that the Cult of the Ancestor Moth play a minor yet important role in Tamriel's history. Their study into the Elder Scrolls and the glimpses into the future that it brings allows mortals to tap into one of the most unknown and volatile sources of power and wisdom on Tamriel. And because of that, the Order and their priests are the closest link that mortals have to understanding the intricacies of time and creation of Nirn. And their wisdom guides the Emperors of Tamriel, who hope to gain an edge by understanding the future, and as such the Order can influence the course of history in subtle, yet important ways.
And that's about all that I can say about the Moth Priests. Now finally, for this big lore compilation, I want to talk about a 3rd Era subject that I always really enjoyed, the wine industry of Cyrodiil. In Oblivion we see just 2 vineyards, but the lore behind them and the lore behind the greater winemaking industry is actually a lot deeper than you think. Let's talk about it.
So, wine. Cyrodiil has a lot of it, and if you've ever visited this region in the game, which is called the West Weald, you've been in what is in the lore the center of winemaking on Tamriel, a large region which is known for its calm, predictable weather, plenty of rainfall and rich, mildly acidic soil, which makes the area one of the best places around Tamriel to grow wine grapes. In the region, in the lore, we find many vineyards growing all kinds of different grapes, and the grapes and wine of this region have become a bit of an icon, especially the city of Skingrad, which is considered to be Tamriel's wine capital. A fact that the inhabitants of the city tend to be very proud of, as the wine industry has made them rich and has made them prosperous. Now, of course, in the games we only see a handful of vineyards. However, in the lore, the entire region is supposed to be dotted with large vineyards and a lot of small family-owned vineyards that produce the wine that gets shipped all across Tamriel. And it's said that each section of the region apparently has its own specialty, with the vineyards around the city of Skingrad producing robust red wines, while in the west of the West Weald, fruity white wines are the speciality, and in the north of the region they produce long-aged hearty red wines. Meanwhile, the entire region is also dotted with smaller family vineyards that produce all kinds of specialty wines, like sparkling wine similar to real-world champagne. And you've also got the West Weald specialty called the Weald Wallop wine, which we can't find in any of the games, but it's said to be a wine with a lot of alcohol and sugar in it, made from grapes of less successful harvests, making it an often used table wine for the middle class. Everything from luxury wines made for the nobility to cheaper wines made for taverns and inns, it's all made in this region. And nearly all of the best wine artisans and most skilled workers of the industry gather in the West Weald. Like, for example, in the region there's supposed to be a whole field of wine stompers, you know, the people who climb into the tubs filled with grapes and with their feet squash the grapes in order for them to be turned into wine. That's actually a profession, and there's a lot of them in this region. That's pretty amazing. Now, it's honestly a bit of a shame that this part of the lore has gone so underrepresented in the games, because across Cyrodiil and the Empire, the wine made in this region is supposed to be quite a big deal, and in the harvest seasons, the wine industry is one of the biggest employers, with laborers from all across the Empire, even from as far as High Rock, traveling to the West Weald in the harvest season in order to work there and help with the harvest in order to make some coin. These times are so busy that often the vineyard owners will provide on-site breakfast, lunch and presumably dinner, so that the vineyard workers can make as many work hours as possible. I mean, it's really a shame that this lore is so underrepresented, as at least in Oblivion we only get two vineyards, the Cyrodiil Brothers Vineyard and Tamriel's Vineyard. Meanwhile, in the lore there are hundreds, and as I mentioned in my recent video on Tamriel's obscure guilds, there's even a vintners or winemakers guild, which I presume has a pretty big presence in the area in the lore, and would have made for some really fun side quests, I think. But alas, we only have two vineyards to represent this massive and vibrant industry from the lore. Not that that's a bad thing, by the way, because the games have to condense the lore to a smaller bit, and I'm happy that this industry at least made the cut at all, as we haven't seen anyone from, for example, the Ratcatchers Guild, which is said to also be quite big in the lore. So I'll take what I can get. By the way, if you want to know more about the obscure guilds, a link to that video is in the description. Now, the two vineyards that we get to see in Oblivion are Tamriel's Vineyard, which is a relatively new producer of wine, having only recently gotten to prominence in the last few decades before the events of the game, and we get a vineyard run by a family which has been a big name in wine for more than 900 years, and continues to be a big name in the 4th era when the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim takes place, the Cyrodiil Brothers Vineyard. Now, like I said, Tamriel's Vineyard, which is run by a woman named Tamriel, who only recently started, a few decades before the events of the game, is a relatively new institution in Cyrodiil, yet the quality of her wines are said to be unrivaled, with even the Cyrodiil brothers themselves complimenting her for excellent wines, saying that even they might not be able to match her quality, despite their family's centuries of experience. Although Tamriel does charge a premium for her wines, meaning that only the rich merchants and the nobility tend to be able to afford her wine. Meanwhile, the Cyrodiil Vineyard produces high quality wine at a low price. You see, the Cyrodiil family who runs the Cyrodiil Brothers Vineyard has been a big name in wine for centuries, with their entering into the wine industry being somewhere in the final years of the Cyrodiilic Empire, around 900 years before the events of the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion. They seemingly started out as grape farmers in Cyrodiil, and that's how they first seem to have made their fortune, as the grapes got exported all across Tamriel. But then the last leader of the Second Empire was assassinated and the empire fell apart, and a chaotic period on Tamriel called the Interregnum began. That's the period leading up to the founding of the Third Empire under Tiber Septim, which is the empire that we see in Oblivion. Now, that being said, it was during this interregnum, likely because the chaos made it harder to export grapes, that the Cyrodiil family started using their own grapes to make their own wines. And their first wines, the Cyrodiil White Merlot and the Cyrodiil Shiraz wine, instantly became smash hits, and it made the family very rich while also continuing to sell their grapes. Now, by the 3rd and 4th era, their wines get exported all over Tamriel, to the tables and wine cellars of the rich and the nobility. Now, there are 2 little tidbits of lore that so far I forgot to mention, which I think you probably want to know. First, just like in real life, some years produce better harvests and thus better vintages than in other years. In Oblivion, we can hear that the year 399, for example, had a harvest which produced wine that some consider to be once-in-a-lifetime experiences, while the year 415 was also quite good, with those vintages being particularly sought after. The other fact that I couldn't really fit in anywhere else was that with all the migrant workers that come and work in the harvest, there will sometimes be worshippers of the Daedric Prince Sanguine, the Daedric Prince of drunkenness and debauchery, among them, who presumably try to sneak away with wine, which is actually a pretty big deal, as workers get reprimanded pretty badly for stealing or breaking bottles of valuable wine. Oh, and as a final thing, in the Westfield there's also a little subculture where people mix alchemical ingredients with wine, a kind of mix between alchemy and winemaking, which is pretty interesting. You can even hire one of those, specifically Tamika's brother, in the game to make some really special wines for you. Now, observant viewers may have noticed that I already talked about Tamriel's alcoholic drinks before, and I recommend watching that video after this one if you want a bit more of an overview of all of Tamriel's alcohols and like the alcoholic traditions for every race and culture. That video is in the description in case you want to watch it, but in the meantime, since that upload, we got quite a lot of backstory to some of the wines and winemakers of Cyrodiil, so I figured that this topic definitely deserved its own video, especially with the whole Oblivion Remastered coming out. So, a link to that video is in the description.
And that's about all I can say about Oblivion's wine industry. That having been said, this is the end of this compilation. I sincerely hope that I taught you something new about the Elder Scrolls lore today and that you enjoyed it. Or in case of many of you, that you managed to fall asleep, because apparently a lot of you use these compilations to fall asleep, which is... I don't know how to take that. Anyway, if you watched all the way up until the end, why not let me know in the comments what your favorite province of Tamriel is? And also tell me why. That way I know that you will have watched until the very end of the video and we maybe get some nice Elder Scrolls lore discussions going in the comments. Alright, that having been said, it's been a long couple of weeks, 2-3 weeks. I am super tired. I hope next week I have a regular lore video for you again. Sorry for the compilation instead of a lore video after 2 weeks of nothing. I'm gonna try and do something next week. I'm sorry, life's just really busy. See ya.